My name is Linda Barrett, and I am the manager of Genealogy, Local History, and Archives here at the Fort Worth Public Library. And I would like to welcome those of you who are here in person and also our virtual attendees on Zoom. I want to call your attention to a couple of events that the library has going on. Today from 1 to 4 p.m. we're having a Mardi Gras celebration here at the Central Library. There's going to be a food truck across the street at the YMCA parking lot. And then also, you might be interested in this, on Tuesday evening in the same room at 6:30, we'll be having a program on the history of Western swing music with local musician Jenny Mack. So I think that today's topic is a good one for March, which, as you probably know, is Women's History Month. I think that many women who worked in red light districts did so because they found themselves with no means of support, few skills, or almost no opportunity for employment. And so I'm interested to hear what Dr. Webb has to say on that topic. I know it's one that's probably particularly difficult to research because I think that records other than like newspaper records or legal records were either discarded or even intentionally destroyed. So I do have a couple of points of housekeeping. After the presentation, we will have time for questions and answers. For those of you here in the room, Dr. Webb will repeat your question before she answers so that we can be sure that our virtual attendees can hear those questions. And for the virtual attendees, please go ahead and type your questions into the chat as they occur to you, and then we'll go through those all at the end of the presentation as well. And now I'm going to turn things over to Ms. Cody Scott. She is the graduate assistant at the Center for Texas Studies at TCU.
Thank you. Good morning. The Preserving Our Past lecture series is brought to you through the generosity of the Summerlee Foundation and the Summerfield G. Roberts Foundation. We offer these programs September through May, normally on the first Saturday of the month, with the goal of demonstrating the importance of preserving our history and to give you tools and encouragement to be a historian or preservationist yourself. To learn more about the center activities and Texas history and research tips, follow us on Facebook and Instagram at the Center for Texas Studies at TCU. Our next program is going to be April 2nd, and Monica Perales from the University of Houston will be joining us for Finding Smeltertown, Uncovering Family and Community History, to discuss the El Paso history and personal family research that went into her book, Smeltertown. Today, we welcome back Jessica Webb. Her first program, which was standing room only, talked about the Madams of Hell's Half Acre right here in Fort Worth that she presented as she was finishing up her dissertation. She has since completed her study on Fort Worth and San Antonio's red light districts and is here to bring you the second half of her findings. She received her master's and PhD in history from TCU and now works there as a program coordinator for the semester study abroad programs in the Center for International Studies. She's a Texas native who loves to research and share Texas stories. We're very excited to hear from her. Please welcome Jessica Webb.
Good morning. Imagine, it's 8 p.m. on a Saturday evening in September of 1885. Claude Duvall's work has just begun. Duvall ran one of the more infamous houses of prostitution within San Antonio's red light district, a two-story mansion at the northwest corner of South San Saba and Monterey known as the 101. Duvall's grand and elegant brothel presumably attracted patrons willing to spend a large amount of money for their evening of companionship. Potential customers would have been welcomed into the parlor by a porter who would have also acted as security, and Duvall would have held court alongside her employees. The men would have been offered drinks, beer, wine, liquor, and the women of the house would begin to work. Walking around, dancing, flirting, talking, until the customer made their choice of companion. Duvall's role in all of this was as a facilitator. She connected clients with a date that would suit them while smoothing over any bumps that might crop up in a room full of men, women, and alcohol. Once a man had selected his date, he would pay Duvall for his evening of activities and then head to a bedroom. Duvall's night concluded when the last man left the brothel, which could be late into the evening. Her work never truly ended, though, as she balanced various moving parts daily in order to run her successful business. And that is an actual photo. That's the house she lived in. Today's presentation will detail the lives and the careers of the women who ran houses of prostitution, known as madams, in San Antonio's red light district between 1877 and 1920. Specifically, we'll be looking at these women as entrepreneurs, as business owners, looking at the different types of power they wielded as business owners, economic, civic, and social. But to get started, we always got to start with a little brief history of the city. So San Antonio, as it exists today, resulted from the merging of two separate but adjacent colonial settlements in New Spain in the early 1700s. By 1773, the two settlements merged into one town, which became known as San Antonio, and was named the capital of Spanish Texas. It became a city of significance, playing an important role, obviously, in the Texas Revolution, as two battles were fought there. And it grew into the largest city in Texas, with over 8,000 residents by 1860. At the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, San Antonio flourished as a livestock, distribution, commercial, and military center serving the entire Southwest region. There we go. This is a bird's eye view of San Antonio in 1873. As you can already see it, it's quite sprawling. As San Antonio grew, so too did the sex trade. The earliest recorded instances of it in the city are in 1817, when city officials expelled 9 prostitutes from the city. But this expulsion seemed to have little effect, as prostitution was fully embedded in San Antonio by the time of the Civil War. The main and military plazas and the adjacent streets like Houston and Commerce contained saloons, gambling parlors, and houses of prostitution. In 1860, San Antonio's population was a little over 8,000, which then expanded to 12,000 10 years later, and by 1880, over 20,000 people lived in the city. So you can see the difference, going from 1873 to 1886. During those same 2 decades, the 1870s and the 1880s, new saloons, gambling parlors, and brothels emerged. For example, the San Antonio City Directory listed 62 saloons in 1877 and 156 in 1887. Now, it's more difficult to ascertain the growth of prostitution, since the City Directory didn't exactly list brothels in their directory. But a sample of newspaper articles from the 1870s and 1880s shows that the number of articles written about prostitutes or madams nearly quadrupled from the 1870s to the 1880s. By 1880, the majority of the brothels could be found near the main and military plaza, which was the center of the city. And that's really zoomed in. But so there you see it. You've got your main military plaza, and then they would have been on the plazas themselves as well as on the adjacent streets. Now, at this point, San Antonio didn't have a true red light district. They were, like I said, kind of sprinkled throughout. They weren't situated in one central location, but there was still a considerable presence of vice within the city. During the 1880s, the sex trade increased dramatically as San Antonio also increased. They expanded from 20,000 people to almost 38,000, nearly doubling in size. And in the 1880s are where we see a shift to an actual concentrated red light district. By the 1890s, the majority of the vice would have been contained west of the San Pedro Creek, and it would remain there for the next 40 years. So this is a map of San Antonio in 1909. That square is west of the San Pedro Creek, and there it is. Right here, there's your main and military plazas, and there is the red light district. So not on the main and the military plazas, but close enough. And this is actually a local historian's representation of the red light district. So as you can see, it's basically one concentrated area where all of this stuff is happening. Now, railroads and military forts, among other industries, meant that San Antonio contained a substantial customer base for brothels, and as well as all other vice found in the red light district. But the other important factor in the growth of prostitution in the late 19th century was arguably the presence of the madam. In the last few decades of the 1800s, many cities west of the Mississippi experienced population booms. You know, we have the Civil War ends, and then we see this kind of mass migration move west. And the sex trade expanded to supply the rising demand, which included the centralization of prostitution in one area. This is where we start to see really the golden age of the red light district. Now, this expansion of the sexual economy, this creation of the red light district in all these cities, allowed women to, quote, create a permanent and professional class of prostitutes, end quote. The combination of a more consistent population of prostitutes and the concentration of vice into red light district changed how it functioned. Essentially, all of these things led to the professionalization of prostitution. The early iteration of prostitution generally looked like street walking, working out of saloons. It really transitions in the latter decades of the 19th century to brothel-based prostitution within a red light district. A brothel, or a house of prostitution, there's lots of fun names for it, in its most basic form was a place men visited in order to have sexual activity of some type with a prostitute. It was generally managed by a woman known as a madam, and brothels have existed basically as long as prostitution has. It's, you know, there have been brothels, there were brothels in ancient Rome, right? This is a thing that's always existed. But they became a significant part of the red light district in response to the growing numbers of customers and the growing numbers of women and prostitutes, you know, answering for these customers. Brothels and the madams who ran them could, in a way, control the lewd activity within the district as they kept it relatively contained. Furthermore, they offered a safer and more secure place for these women to work. It's a lot safer to work in a house where the men are coming to you than to be walking out along the street. Just on its base, it's safer. And then finally, they offered an economic value to the city where they were located. But none of that is possible without the madam, as the madam controls the brothel and the prostitutes who worked there. And madams and these houses of prostitution become a significant factor in the expansion of the red light district in San Antonio in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So before we really delve into San Antonio specifically, I want to do a quick outline of the variety of forms that prostitution took in a red light district. The types of prostitution breaks down for the most part along class lines. So at the top, you have parlor houses. These are high-class elite houses of prostitution. These generally are going to employ the most attractive, the most well-trained girls. The customers are rich, generally well-connected. They could be legally rich, like a politician or law enforcement, or they could be illegally rich, like a gambler or an outlaw. Now, the women who worked in these houses charged typically between $5 and $10 for a date. And these are two houses that existed in San Antonio's red light district. So we've already seen that one. That's Claude Duvall's, the 101. On the left is many years after it stopped working as a house of prostitution, was Fort Allen, which was one of the most infamous brothels in San Antonio's red light district. So after that, you move one level down, you get kind of your middle class. These could be called bawdy houses. Sometimes they just called them boarding houses, although that was definitely a euphemism for what was going on. These are kind of are going right for the middle. They're catering to the men of the middle class who have enough money to avoid the dives, but definitely don't have enough money to be going to parlor houses. These are typically either very, very young girls who've just started out and are getting kind of their training in a middle class or kind of a mid-tier brothel, or they're the women who have aged out or are no longer able to work in a parlor house. So it's a step down, you could say. Unfortunately, there are very few existing photos of the red light district. I'm lucky I have some, But of this kind of middle class in San Antonio, I couldn't find any. So these are actually pictures from Fort Worth's House Half Acre, just to give you an idea. For example, this is actually on top of a saloon, as is that one. So these were definitely the kinds of things where it probably wasn't a freestanding piece of property, but it was attached to other things. And then your final rung of the ladder are the dives and the cribs. These are basically one-room shacks. They're the cheapest prostitutes. They're charging generally between 25 and 50 cents for a date. So the men who are patronizing these women are working class. They're poor. They might be, young. These are generally going to be the oldest women in the red light district, the most worn. I don't know how you want me to say this, but yes, that's what's happening in the cribs. These are women who are no longer able to be employed in a brothel. And these are the cribs for San Antonio. So this is a Lewis Hine photo. If you know who Lewis Hine is, he took a lot of photos of America in the early 1900s. This is in 1909. So as you can see, we've got this little crib. There's a door. You're going to walk in. It's going to be one room. There's going to be a bed, and then generally a stand or a bureau with a pitcher with water. And that's what you're getting. This is kind of those same cribs, if you can see, but in the 1970s. So San Antonio hadn't gotten rid of them yet. So that's exactly what they would have looked like. But today's presentation, although cribs and middle-class brothels are just as interesting, is focused on that top level, those parlor houses. And the reason why is because these are the elite, right? These are the ones who are leaving records. I can't tell you who rented a crib because it was a cash business, right? They're paying their few coins every single day. But madams in parlor houses are taking out mortgages, and they are in the court system. So that is why I'm going to be spending so much time today, because yes, they're very, very important in the red light district. They're kind of the economic beacon, but they also leave records, which is really helpful as a historian. So a brothel, like I said, base level, requires 4 things: a dwelling of some type, the woman running it, the women working in it, and then a customer, right? That's what you need for a brothel. Like I said, madams are really the most important variable to that. They can really determine if it's going to succeed or fail by their ability to run this business. The first thing that a madam needed in order to be a madam was the property, the house of prostitution. You can't be a madam if you don't have a place to run. Property ownership was vital to being a madam of a first-class brothel. The majority of the elite madams in San Antonio owned their own houses of prostitution. They did not rent them, which is what you might see more in the middle-class realm. The women that ran these parlor houses, they didn't start there. Most women who became madams started as prostitutes. They started by working in the red light district, and then they worked their way up. And really, a great example of that in San Antonio is Sadie Ray. So Sadie Ray, in 1885, she worked for Miss Blanche Dearwood. You know that because she says boards, BDS, boards, right? 2 years later, in 1887, she starts running her own. Now this is a smaller brothel. It's kind of mid-level at 316 South Concho. And then, in the summer of 1888, she buys her first house of prostitution, a large 2-story frame brothel, which she ran for the next 7 years before she retired. So that is kind of a standard journey that these women would take to end up with owning their own place. So while these brothels could vary in appearance, parlor houses had a lot of consistency in the way they looked. They were typically large, they were beautiful, they had obviously multiple bedrooms, a large foyer, multiple entrance and exits, things like that really delineated it as a parlor house. Many of these brothels had previous lives as other dwellings, a house, a business, things like that. Madams would generally have to modify them to get what they needed in that house of prostitution. And since we're already talking about her, I'm just going to continue to use Sadie Ray. So in 1890 and 1891, Sadie Ray made multiple modifications to her brothel at 215 Southeast Street, so the one she bought in 1888. As this building had previously existed as a brothel, she bought it from a madam who was retiring. It had the bones that she needed, right? It has these extra bedrooms, it has some of the things she needs, but if she's going to level up to be kind of this elite madam, she knew she needed to make some changes. So she builds a $1,400 dwelling. That's what this article is right here, Sadie Ray, dwelling, $1,400. This could have been servants' quarters. It could have been a back addition to the building. The next year she added a gallery. That could have connected it to other additions she made that were not recorded, but she's consistently in the newspapers with these building permits and these things where she's adding on to her house. The Sanborn Map Company, they were a fire insurance map company. They created these fire insurance maps, and they're really, really helpful because they specifically list what type of building it was. And lucky for us, they even specify if it's a house of prostitution. Now, they use female boarding, but that is a euphemism. We know what that means. And as you can see, if you look, this is a comparison. They published them in 1888 and 1892. It is very obvious that she made significant changes, not only to her house, but to the lot. She's added a servant's quarter. She's added a whole second floor in some of the areas, right? So she's making these changes, allowing her to employ more women, which then leads to her making more money. And it worked because the house before she bought it only housed between 5 and 7 women. She was able to house 13. So double, basically, right? Think about that extra income. Now, an alternative option for madams was to just construct their own building. By choosing this path, they would have control over exactly what they needed before it was even built. And in 1875, we're going to go back to Fort Allen, Mary A. Palmer, who would become known as Blanche Dearwood, which was very common for these women to take on aliases, purchased a plot of land in San Antonio where she built Fort Allen. It had a hard rock foundation, 12-foot high walls, and a tin mansard-style roof, which is what it became known for, this beautiful roof. It had room for about at least 8 women, sometimes more, depending on the year, to work and live there. Sally Brewer followed in Palmer's footsteps in 1883 when she built her own brothel. She built a large stone building for $15,000 that became her brothel, which was known as the 110. And really, having control over the design and the construction really allowed them to get exactly what they needed, right? They knew what a parlor house needed, and so by building it from the ground up, they could design it there for their own self. And really, the clearest examples of this happening are the Dora Mcnew brothels in San Antonio. So in 1896, Dora Mcnew purchased an empty lot, number 4, in the 400 block of Matamoros Street for $650 in cash. In 1905, she purchased the lot next to hers on Matamoros, number 3, for $500 in cash. She also bought lot number 2 in that same block. Now, Mcnew was her legal name, but most knew her as Hattie Baxter, and she was another one of the women who started as a prostitute and then became a madam. Right? She walked that path. She got her start at Carrie Anderson's brothel. She worked in Fort Allen. Really, Blanche Dearwood pops up all the time. It was like a rite of passage. You just had to work in Fort Allen in order to move it on up. And then she started to work as a madam. She worked as a madam in 2 different brothels that she rented before buying her first one at 410 Matamoros. In 1906, she bought another piece of property, which cost $3,500 that she paid in cash. She rented out her brothel on Matamoros to another madam, and then over the next 2 decades just starts buying lots all over the city. She's purchasing lots all over while continuing to build on her big lots on Matamoros Street. And she ends up with 2 large brothels that she built herself. A 3,000 square foot 1-story at 416 Matamoros, 4,800 square foot 2-story at 420 Matamoros on lots 2 and 3. By 1920, she'd settled into her large, beautiful houses of prostitution where she remained for the next decade. And we are very, very lucky because these lasted until the 70s and 80s. And so what happened was, before they tore them down to build the 410, before they tore them down, they took blueprints. And so we actually have the floor plans of what these houses would have looked like. So this is her 1-story of 416. That's the architectural drawing of what the front of it would have looked like. This looks like a normal house. But as you can see here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 what could be bedrooms, 2 larger rooms. Those could be bedrooms, but most likely were a dining room or a sitting room. You have a large foyer which would have been the receiving area, right? So these are built for a specific reason. You also have multiple entrances and exits, if you see that. You've got one here, you've got one there, you've got one there, you've got one there, you've got, right? Because, you know, sometimes they don't want to have to go back through the front, they just want to leave out of where they are, right? So this is her smaller one, and then you get the building at 420. Yeah. So this was, as you can see, quite large. Like I said, it was over 4,800 square feet. It's got so many rooms, and it has these architectural details. Every room has a window, right? So you have this beautiful, beautiful house, and it gives us a really, really clear picture of what these kind of top-level houses looked like. So we're, again, very lucky that the San Antonio Municipal Archives held on to these. So we've got the building, right, which on its own represented the affluence of these madams. But how they filled and decorated their parlor houses illustrated even more the wealth that they had. Because parlor houses, because they're charging so much, they know what they're attracting. They're attracting men with money. So they are wanting to present kind of this opulent and put together image, which they achieve, yes, from the house itself, but also from what they put inside it. And this starts from the ground up, literally. As madams in San Antonio covered the floors of their parlor houses with lush carpets in a variety of styles and materials, including Brussels, tapestry, velvet. They decorated the walls with oil paintings, with numerous types of mirrors, with statues, with pictures. They have windows covered with curtains made of lace or chenille. And then in terms of lighting, they would have chandeliers. They would have gas and electric lighting. They would have decorative lighting, like newel post. And those are the big, fancy lights that would sit at the end of your grand staircase. They would sit right at the end. That's a newel post light. All of these things were inside San Antonio brothels. Again, I do not have pictures of the interiors, so I am giving you an example. So up at the top, this is Tilly Howard's brothel. She ran a pretty infamous house of prostitution in El Paso. This is her parlor. So as you can see, look at these huge curtains, you've got a little couch, you know, all this decorative stuff. And then these two pictures are from Belle Breezing's brothel. She was a madam in Lexington, Kentucky, who, again, was quite infamous. That is her personal parlor. That's actually her sitting with that very serious look on her face. But you can just see, I mean, look at, there's little statues, and there's a fireplace, and there's curtains, and this is her bedroom. She has a portrait of herself, right? She has this huge bed set, right? These are expensive, right? This is a lot that's going into these houses. So the important question is, especially for the madams that are maybe starting with building a building or purchasing a house for the first time, how do they fill their parlor houses up with this stuff? How do they afford it? And the answer is very, very simple, and it's the answer that we would answer it today, which is credit. During this era, when women ran businesses on their own, and when men did, they depended on credit, which was difficult to get for women as, quote, inexperienced women were rarely judged good risk for credit, end quote. Local suppliers would only extend credit to female proprietors with whom they had established relationships, which meant that trust was really, really important to these women getting credit. In San Antonio, Erastus Reed, F.J. Beidel, and Rhodius and Temsky were vendors who regularly offered credit to madams for things like furnishings, remodeling, and musical instruments, specifically pianos. The ability to obtain credit to establish or expand their brothels highlights how these men viewed madams as legitimate business owners. It also illustrates that these men trusted these women, since they were willing to risk their profits if businesses failed. It also, finally, shows how profitable parlor houses could be, since these businessmen allowed thousands of dollars in credit to be extended to madams for a business that was technically illegal, because they knew the money would be paid back, and generally it was. So these are two examples. As you can see right here, we have Ione Palmer buying a piano. Here's her agreement. She's got paying a down payment, then she's going to pay a monthly. And over here is Claude Duvall buying furniture, and if you actually look close enough, you can see it's starting to list it. So, right, French, there we go, Brussels carpets, right, listing, they would be detailed. That's how I know what's in these houses, is this lovely, lovely credit, because they list exactly what they're buying. Now, While a beautiful house with luxurious furnishings was nice, men patronized parlor houses for one reason, and that was for the women. The women who lived and worked in parlor houses were generally the most attractive, the most well-trained women in the red light districts. We do not have any photos that I know of. If you know of one, share them with me, of the women who worked in San Antonio. So again, I'm giving you examples. This is a woman who worked in Storyville, New Orleans. As you can see, she's got a fur wrap, she has jewelry, she looks beautiful and put together. On the right, there was a kind of a cache of film discovered of a red light district, or a house of prostitution in Reading, Pennsylvania, where a photographer was a patron, and so he went in and just took all these pictures of these women. So it's the same woman, and obviously I blocked out because I didn't know if children were coming. But as you can see, she's dressed just like a normal middle-class lady, but obviously, right, she's taking photos in the nude as well, right? So these are the kinds of women who are going to be working in these parlor houses. So in order to charge the kind of prices that madams are in parlor houses, right, we're talking $5 to $10 for a date, which means 5 to 10 times more than they're going to pay at like a middle class and way more than they'd get at a dive. So she has to provide the best of the best. So these women would have been skilled at dancing, flirting, conversing, and obviously all of the required sexual activities. And we don't have any idea how madams got these women to work in their brothels. These are the kinds of records that don't exist. So we can make educated guesses. Presumably, they recruited them, probably from the houses in the city, especially when you look at records and you see this woman worked with Carrie Anderson, and then she worked with Blanche Dearwood, and then she worked, right? So are they recruiting them? Are they stealing them? But also, you start to see a little bit of a social network with madams, especially in a place like Texas, where you have Fort Worth, Dallas, Austin, Houston, San Antonio. All of those cities have red light districts, and women move. And so you kind of see a little bit of a social network. So one assumption we can make is that potentially they were connecting with madams from other cities about hiring women for their own houses of prostitution. But again, it's just one of those things that we just do not have the answers to. So they've got the building, they've got the furnishings, they've got the women. So now they can open their parlor house for business. So how do you advertise? How do you get it out that your parlor house is the top tier and it's got the best women? Again, we don't really have records for this, but we can, educated guess, say that word of mouth is probably the best way that they advertised. Some madams hired drummers, which were young boys that would hang out in really populated areas like a railroad station and be like, hey, you should go over and check out, Claude Duvall's brothel, the 110, and then point them in the way of that when they would see unattached men. But in San Antonio, one added advantage that they had was advertising in print. In 1911, it has been theorized that it was William Keelman who owned a saloon, and it's because his picture's at the end of the booklet, published the Blue Book for visitors, tourists, and those seeking a good time while in San Antonio, Texas. This is modeled on the Blue Book, which was published in Storyville, New Orleans red light district for years. And it's filled with advertisements for saloons, restaurants, gambling parlors, a lot of other places for entertainment, things like boxing. But its main purpose really is this, the directory of houses and women. This lists, as you can see, the name, the street, and sometimes the name is the name of the place, and sometimes it's the proprietor, and how to get there, right? Street, and it's divided by classes. So A, B, and C. So A, these are going to be all the women that I'm talking about. B is kind of your middle class. C, we're getting into like the divey saloon part. But outside of the directory, you also have advertisements. So these are just running throughout it, right? You can see this one's above a bowling alley advertisement, right? So these madams are doing these big, it's a third of the page. They're listing their name or potentially the name of their brothel if their brothel is well known, the location, the phone number, and how to get there on the streetcar, right? They're really making sure that you know how to get there. So being in this booklet presumably brought business to these parlor houses, right? It's a big deal. It also kind of shows the laxness of law enforcement if you're able to be in print like this and confident enough that you're like, oh, they're not going to shut me down. And we're going to talk about that, promise. Now, so if madams maintain all these elements, right, they've got all these moving parts, but they've got them under control, they could really become quite wealthy. Their income generally came from two sources. So first was selling liquor inside their parlor house. They would sell beer, wine, alcohol, always at a super high price, right, because they could. And then they took a percentage of their employees' earnings. And this varied from brothel to brothel, from parlor house to parlor house. Sometimes they took 15%. Some madams I've seen could have taken up to as much as 50%, right? It just varied. But through those kind of two revenue streams, they earned a lot of money. And when they began making this excessive amounts of money, they generally invested their money in two areas: real estate and jewelry. Those were the two things. Property was a safe place to invest their earnings and diversify their holdings, and a lot of madams owned multiple pieces of property. I've already talked about Dora Mcnew. She had lots all over San Antonio, and she would just, she started small, and then by the time she was done, she had amassed so much property. But other good examples are Maude Campbell. Maude Campbell bought her first piece of property in February 1895 when Sadie Ray sold her East Street brothel. In 1907, she purchased a lot on North Matamoros Street for $3,300. 2 years later, she bought 2 more lots on Matamoros, and in 1910, she purchased a lot on Monterey. Now, alongside all of these purchases, she's consistently adding things to these dwellings. So she's adding bay windows, she's building a gallery onto it, right? So that by 1915, the city of San Antonio actually assessed her property, and they assessed it to be worth over $22,000 in 1915, which, adjusting for inflation, is over $600,000 today. So, all from a business that, again, that is supposed to be illegal. Jewelry offers another area where they're able to kind of invest their wealth. The main reason for that is because typically gold, silver, and jewels, especially at the turn of the century, held their value a lot more than things like paper money. But they had multiple purposes because then they could be kind of a part of their wardrobe, right? So I'm wearing this beautiful diamond necklace, which is showing you how prosperous I am, which is showing you how good my parlor house is, right? But they could be easily transported, and they could become collateral for loans or credit. So they have all these different purposes. And jewelry took various forms. So Sally Brewer, for example, had a cluster diamond ring that consisted of 10 diamonds. Claude Duvall had a gold watch. Beatrice Benedict had over $3,000 worth of diamond jewelry. And purchasing jewels or property really allowed them to feel some security regarding their money. And again, became markers of a successful career. If you own 10 lots, if you own that much property, again, that's a real marker of how successful you've been able to run your business. So, the madams who were successful enough to invest in property and build their wealth often had two things in common. And those two things are career longevity and whiteness. So the two main things for elite madams. There's one existing picture of a madam from San Antonio, which is going to come up later, and I'm sure some of you may know who that is. But I did want to give you an example of what these women looked like. So again, we've got Tilly Howard from the middle, from El Paso. There's her horse, Rowdy. Belle Breezing, so there's a portrait of her. And then on the far right is Maddie Silks. She owned brothels in Denver. But all three of these would have kind of been that top echelon of madam. So madams who owned these successful parlor houses were generally older than other women working in the red light district, and they often had much longer careers. On average, madams were older than prostitutes because of the fleeting nature of a prostitute's career, right? So you don't have that many years where you're that profitable as a prostitute, as crass as that is to say, right? You age out in a way. Madams, though, they could work into old age. They could work to be 70. In the late 19th and early 20th century, women in San Antonio had careers that spanned decades. So Ignacia Cortez, Claude Duvall, Lou Lamont, Blanche Dearwood, they all worked for at least 15 years. Sally Brewer worked for over 30, right? So these are careers for them. Longevity is an important part. As they continue to run their parlor house, they become wealthier, they build up their customer base, and because they become kind of, like I said, an institution, they really are able to strengthen their political connections in the city. The other thing, so we've got career longevity. The other thing is that the majority of women running elite houses of prostitution in San Antonio were white. San Antonio was a multiracial, multi-ethnic city. It had a Hispanic population as the second largest ethnic group. It had a black population that was smaller but still significant. And so black, white, and Hispanic women lived in both cities and worked in the sex trade. So why, when we get to this level of madam, are they basically all white? And the answer is pretty simple, which is that economic and racial discrimination, right? There's lots of pieces that come into that, but that's a real big thrust. During the last 3 decades of the 19th century, black Texans were the targets of serious discriminatory practices in the realms of politics, business, education, and homeownership, among others. The Hispanic population also found themselves, quote, subject to a different treatment, to a different life, and a lower status than white Texans, end quote. Black and Hispanic women had the added difficulties of gender discrimination, as Texas women in this era still had few political or civic rights. The intersection of these prejudices made it harder for these women to buy or rent the kind of property that they would need in order to run a parlor house. The majority of black prostitutes in San Antonio worked in cribs or dives, that lowest level, and racial segregation in the cities and in their red light districts affected the very few black women who were madams, as, quote, most bawdy houses maintained color separation among their inmates, end quote. So black madams then had a hard time obtaining white women as employees and had to depend solely on that smaller black population for their house of prostitution. But they also had little access to capital. So while many of these white brothel keepers had lines to credit, could get a mortgage for a piano or for a house full of furnishings, black women weren't able to. So the women who wanted to own and manage brothels were relegated for the most part, like I said, to those lower levels, right? Maybe a middle class if they're lucky. Hispanic women did have it somewhat easier. So while they were still subordinate to white people in the racial hierarchy of San Antonio, they were still seen by that larger society as superior to the black population, which gave them a little bit of privilege. Of the existing records, there's really only one non-white madam who could be categorized as elite, as running a parlor house, and that's Ignacia Cortez. There were also several Hispanic women who ran middle and lower class brothels. We see that a lot. And for these Hispanic women, the color lines were blurry. So they could have white women working in their houses of prostitution, which again is an added benefit. Ignacia Cortez had several white women working in her parlor house. But still, white madams remained prominent in San Antonio, both in terms of wealth, in terms of civic, and in terms of social power. For these women, these elite madams, after having a lengthy career, one thing that they had that a lot of women in the red light district did not is the ability to retire. They could get out of the industry, which was next to impossible for prostitutes, but could even be difficult for the lower level madams. So for example, Ernestine Gordon, she retired to California. She moved to California. She worked as a madam for a decade in San Antonio, so she moves to California, she retires, and then she sells her brothel to Sadie Ray, so that Sadie Ray can kind of jump up a level and start. Some madams even chose to retire in order to reform themselves. Claude Duvall, she's from that first slide, her real name was Mary Elvolino. She converted to Christianity after attending a revival in 1895. And she ran this large, beautiful parlor house at 223 South San Saba, and decided after she converted to donate it to the Methodist Church. And the Methodist Church turned it into a rescue home for fallen girls, and Duvall actually became the matron of it. So, I mean, she retired and flipped fully the other way, right? But she had the ability to do so. Ernestine Gordon has the ability to do so, which you just don't see a lot. So we've talked a lot about them as businesswomen, right? They're running these houses, all the pieces that go into it. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the city and their civic power. Since the mid-19th century, the San Antonio city government prohibited prostitution and the keeping of brothels using city ordinances, except for a tiny little span of time, which I'll talk about. The reality, though, was that the sex trade endured and expanded throughout the late 1890s and late 1880s, 1890s, and into the 20th century. And money, of course, explains that contradiction, because San Antonio's government formed a fees and fines system with the women who worked in the sex trade. So This arrangement involved the regular arrest and fining of prostitutes and madams. Essentially, this process created indirect operating licenses for the women of these red light districts. Crafting this relationship with city officials and law enforcement was really the most important use of a madam's civic power. They used their economic status, especially their wealth, to craft this space where they could actually kind of grow and thrive. And this is a really good example. So we've got 1883, 1883, and 1885, and you'll see a lot of these names are the same, right? So Sally Brewer, Sally Brewer, Sally Brewer, right? So they are basically brought in, sometimes multiple times a year, sometimes once a year, charged an amount, they pay their fine, and then they go. And that kind of allows them to continue working. Especially because for a lot of cities, and San Antonio and Fort Worth were some of them, fines at the lowest level, so these would be district court, sometimes it was even recorder's court, they paid police salaries. So in a way, this is paying the salaries of the policemen who are arresting them, right? So creating this kind of licensing system. The women who owned and ran these parlor houses understood that the power that they had stemmed from their business and from the men who were their customers. The men who patronized parlor houses had one thing in common, which is that they had a lot of money, or at least enough to spend kind of an insane amount on a date. Especially because for parlor houses, you generally see them charged about $5 to $10 in the records. And that translates roughly to about $150 to $300 today. So if a patron wanted anything special, anything that's out of the norm, that's even more, right? So these are men who have money. And so they were generally men from the upper class or men who had made money from illegal means, right? For example, in the 1880s, Sid Stanforth, who was a popular and well-off San Antonio lawyer, frequented Ignacia Cortez's parlor house. A San Antonio publication actually described the customers of these houses as, quote, bankers and politicians and a lot of the upper crust, end quote. As the high cost of companionship was only the gatekeeping for parlor houses, men who made their money illegally were also served alongside politicians, law enforcement, businessmen. And the most infamous patrons of San Antonio's red light district were, of course, Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and the Wild Bunch Gang. Now, I'm sure most of you have seen this photo before. It's taken in Hell's Half Acre, Fort Worth's red light district in 1900. And yes, they did spend time there, but not really. Their preference in Texas was San Antonio. And specifically, Fannie Porter's House of Prostitution. Fannie Porter ran a beautiful 13-room parlor house at 503 South San Saba from 1897 to 1903. It was luxurious, it was discreet, and it and her female employees attracted the Wild Bunch. There are even some who theorize that Etta Place, who was the Sundance Kid's female companion, actually worked there. There's no concrete proof of that, but that has been theorized. But it also offered a safe and kind of private refuge where they could hide out when things got too hot for them. And this map, which I showed you earlier, which is that hand-drawn, this is there it is. There's the red light district. That is where Fannie Porter's house was. And again, that is the only existing photo of a madam in San Antonio that I know of, Fannie Porter. Okay, so being a part of the vice industry marked madams and prostitutes, any woman who worked in the red light district, as other. So they didn't really have the ability to be a part of the larger female society of San Antonio, but existed more in the margins, right? They're not gonna get an invitation to join the San Antonio Women's Club. It's not gonna happen. Madams then actually, because they weren't really allowed to take part in the typical activities of middle to upper class white women, which is what many of them were in terms of their money, they took on the privileges usually reserved for men, including running their businesses, regularly appearing in court, often as criminals, sometimes as the objects of civil lawsuits, sometimes as the originators of those lawsuits. So they bought and sold real estate. They crafted political relationships. They were not allowed in this feminine realm of San Antonio, so they then said, fine, we'll just be in the masculine realm. We'll do what most upper and middle and upper class women in San Antonio couldn't do, right? So they regularly took up space in the civic sphere in order to further their own ends. Generally, if they were in this kind of civic sphere, so the court system, the newspapers, they were protecting themselves or their businesses. And the courts are really one of the major places that this happens. A prime example of this is Emilia Garza. On December 16th, 1889, the San Antonio City Council, led by Mayor Brian Callahan, passed Ordinance JH 443. This is right here. Which required madams to, quote, apply to the city clerk of the city of San Antonio for a license to keep such house, end quote. The license cost $500 and had to be renewed annually. That's $500 in 1889. Furthermore, each woman employed within a house of prostitution had to purchase a license, which was much, much cheaper, and they had to go and see the city physician every week for a regular health examination in order to keep that license. So, I was very, very lucky. I was at the San Antonio Municipal Archives, and we were going through these boxes, and stuffed at the bottom of a box in a folded up manila file folder, we found the license. That's it right there. So this is what you would get. You would go and you would see the doctor, and you would pay your $1. Yep, pay you $1. He would check you out. He'd write your name, your license number, he'd put the date, and then he would say, what is the condition of health? And if that's hard for you to read, I understand, that says good. So that is an actual license that was given to a woman, given to Minnie Thompson. Pretty cool, right? But this is a huge problem for these women. These women own their own business. They're in control, and now they're saying, I gotta pay a fee. My women have to pay a fee. We have to go see the doctor every week? Absolutely not. This is ridiculous. Some women just immediately like, whatever, I'll pay my license, fine. If I keep getting to do what I'm doing, it's a drop in the bucket. But not all. And Emilia Garza was one of them. Emilia Garza did not buy a license, and then she was arrested and charged on January 14th, 1890 with violating this ordinance. Her lawyer, she had a lawyer, Leonidas N. Walthall, immediately applied for a writ of habeas corpus. His goal was to attack the validity of said ordinance, contending that the city was not authorized by the charter to enact it, and that it was contrary to the general laws of the state, because the state of Texas prohibited prostitution. So therefore, he believed it was void. The Bexar County District Judge, W.W. King, denied the writ, because obviously he's in Bexar County. He knows what's up. He's like, no, just pay your fine, be quiet. But Walthall appealed it up, and he appealed it to the Texas Supreme Court of Appeals. They heard Garza's case on February 26, 1890, and they agreed with her. They said that the San Antonio City Charter did not, in fact, give the city council the power to license houses of prostitution. And furthermore, this ordinance was, quote, repugnant to a valid general law of the state, end quote. So the Texas Court of Appeals ruled in her favor, claiming the new ordinance to be unconstitutional. Pretty good use of the civic sphere, right? She was able to get this entire ordinance wiped out. She never had to pay that $500. Her women never had to get a license, never had to be medically examined, right? So a pretty nice result for her. Another area outside of the courts, which was something that they all used a lot, another area was print, newspapers. Newspapers were a constant in the lives of San Antonio residents because it was really the primary way to get relevant and recent news. And from 1877 to 1920, San Antonio had multiple newspapers running at the same time, where people were able to get, their news of what's going on both in their city and around the state. And madams used the newspaper to protect themselves and their businesses. So, for example, on June 2nd, 1886, the San Antonio Daily Light published in its regular crime column what cases had been heard before the court. And one of these cases claimed that Blanche Dearwood, the infamous Madam of Fort Allen, had been charged with, quote, the high crime of knocking a cigarette out of a man's mouth, end quote. Obviously, a little tongue-in-cheek there. But Dearwood saw this, and she reached out to the newspaper, and she said, I had nothing to do with that. Absolutely not. Please print a correction. And they did. Right? They printed a correction for this woman. And there are two more examples. They would use the newspapers as well to say, hey, that was another person named Carrie Anderson. That wasn't me, right? I am not a common vagrant and prostitute. Lily Gibson says, I didn't get in that fight. You got the name wrong, right? They're using the newspaper to say, this is my reputation, and you're messing it up. You're messing up my business. And the newspaper, again, it's wild. They printed it, right? Awesome, love it. So elite madams had a reputation. They used the newspapers or the courts to protect it, among other things. This is just an example of the civic sphere. There's lots more that I could talk about if I had all day. We could talk about philanthropy. We could talk about all kinds of things. But we're going to move on. We've talked about economics, we've talked about money, we've talked about kind of the civic space. The final thing we're going to talk about is kind of the social sphere. So what's happening in this red light district amongst the women? So we've kind of already touched on the fact that these women are isolated from the rest of polite society. So what that means is they create a social society themselves, right? They create their own social system. And just like pretty much every social system in the world, there's an inherent hierarchy to it. Specifically, madams were placed higher than prostitutes, right? Madams are the employers. They own the property, they control the wages, they do all of this, while prostitutes are the employees, right? They know that their ability to work in these houses are connected directly to the madam. So that just, like I said, inherently puts them below them. So what this does is it creates a relationship in the red light district that's obviously combative, but it's also very considerate. So it's a little bit contradictory in its nature. So in terms of combative, madams, like I said, controlled how large the cut of wages that they took from prostitutes, and it could vary. But they also had other ways of kind of exerting that power over these women. A lot of times they could offer them lines of credit. So maybe they notice, oh, you need a new dress. Well, I will give you credit to get that dress. And then they charge them interest, and then they keep them in debt, right? Tale as old as time. But sometimes when employees were in so much debt, madams would then seize their personal property, which 9 times out of 10 was their trunk. And for these women, their trunk was their life. It had everything in it. It had extra change of clothes, it had their makeup, it had all of their jewelry, it had family possessions, right? So it's a big deal when they're doing these things like seizing their property. And there's not really recourse for these prostitutes, right? There's no union they can join. I mean, there should have been, but there's no. They can't report it to the labor board, right? They can't go call OSHA, right? There's nothing they can do. And so they understand that all of that is resting in the hands of these madams, which creates this combative relationship, which is why you see, I wish I thought about it, but I didn't, newspaper articles where they're like, there was this massive brawl because this prostitute hit this madam, or there was a fight and there was a verbal altercation, or she set the madam's curtains on fires, right? You see all these kind of moments of aggression because when you read, like, yeah, I get it, I'd be frustrated too, right? So yeah, it is a really combative relationship. And then it's also a relationship that involves a lot of caretaking. It's not all bad. Madams took care of their employees. Now, obviously, that's really self-serving, right? You're going to bring a doctor to your house to make sure that the women are taken care of, but also so that there aren't rumors like, yeah, oh, the old 110, you're going to get something if you go there, right? So it is self-serving, but they're still taking care of the women. They also acted as gatekeeper in their house of prostitution. They, as madams, got really good at understanding who were going to be the troublemakers and the men who could come in and maybe had a violent streak or were there to cause problems. And so they would do their very best to protect the women in their house from these kinds of situations. But really, the most important ways that these madams took care of the women in their house and not in their house was in death. You see a lot of death in the red light district. Disease, obviously, but pretty high rates of suicide. So these madams would do what they could to take care of the women in their red light district. So Blanche Deerwood, for example, good old Blanche, she owned her own cemetery plot in the city cemetery in San Antonio. And in January 1884, Lily Howard, who worked in another brothel, Fannie Kelly's, died suddenly. It's pretty bad. And Deerwood offered up half her plot and bought her this beautiful large headstone kind of memorializing her. So it says Lily Howard, it tells where she's born, where she's died, right? But I mean, it's still there, you can go see it. It's this large headstone. And Blanche didn't have to do that, but she did. Over there, as you can see, Emma Bishop, she was another prostitute. She died of dropsy. The funeral, which was largely attended, right? So while the relationships between these women working in the red light district could be contentious, and they were, at the end of the day, they did take care of one another, especially in death. Death was a uniting force in the red light district. When women died, prostitutes and madams united to bury them, giving them a funeral, acting as their surrogate family for many of these women that didn't have that. So while much of the current culture today kind of views the women who chose to work in these Old West red light districts through the lens of kind of salacious tales and bawdy stories and get a load of this, these women are real people. They're real people, and what's more, especially these madams, they're women who ran the parlor houses were businesswomen who had economic status, who had civic and social power. And so this is a narrative of women trying to survive and thrive in a world where they did not have as many options as we do now, or, I mean, as much as the male components. These women, using their shrewdness in business and skills with men, managed to own very successful houses of prostitution. That their business was a house of prostitution and thus illegal and immoral has really overshadowed everything else about them. But it doesn't negate the fact that these parlor houses were profitable. They were well run. Some lasted for decades. The elite madams of San Antonio had a major impact in their city in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and they deserve to have their story told. Thank you.
Okay, in the chat, sorry, I'm having a little struggle with the mouse here. There we go. Okay, somebody said, oh, Reading, Pennsylvania.
Pardon me, never been.
Somebody had said it was pronounced Reading. That was in reference to the photo.
The photos.
Yeah,
Yep.
photos. The rescue home, founded by Claude Duvall, became the Methodist Mission Home, a child placing agency in our times. And then Monica says that building, the Fannie Porter House, just burned down. Somebody says, I missed the first of these presentations on the Madams of Hell's Half Acre. Where can I view that? If you go to YouTube and find the Fort Worth Public Library channel, there is a playlist of these presentations that you can watch it there. Did any of these women leave behind journals, diaries, or letters?
So I wish, but neither in San Antonio nor in Fort Worth, because my dissertation looked at both. I have nothing from the women. The most I have is sometimes they would get quoted in newspapers, but no journals, no diaries, nothing personal. We've got the legal documents, right? But yeah, I don't have anything. If you've got leads on that, though, let me know. But no, nothing from these women themselves.
I just accidentally bounced back up to the top. Let me scroll down here. Hannah Hamad says, great talk. Thanks, Dr. Webb. Beyond the storytelling, what their business model / social network says about the business in the city and the state at the time.
I mean, we're talking about San Antonio especially, right? We're still in that kind of pre-urbanization era. Really, you start to see that after the turn of the century. And so it really is, as you can see, I mean, even looking at non-vice businesses, the models that these madams are using are pretty similar elsewhere, right? They're advertising like non-vice businesses. They are using the court system to their benefit. They're connecting with politicians and lawmakers that they need to get things done. And so you really see a lot of the things that these women are doing mimic the things that are happening outside of the red light district. But like I said, where we really start to see that change is when San Antonio stops just being a city and becomes this big urban center. The red light district actually remains until World War II. It pushes through World War I. If I had time, I would have talked about kind of where we go with San Antonio's red light district. But in World War I, they came in and they were like, shut it down. And San Antonio was like, no, we're good, thanks. Because the soldiers, they've had soldiers in San Antonio since the mid-19th century. And so the soldiers were like, no, this is where we go. And so they ended up, during World War I, they put a prophylactic station in the middle of the red light, at the exits and entrances. They put a hospital in the middle of the red light district because they were like, if they're not gonna shut it down and we can't get the soldiers to stop, at least maybe we can treat them. So yeah, it's very, I would say it's very similar to what's happening there. Okay.
Any questions in here? Okay.
curious, because you're talking about how they banded together to bury someone who passed away. What, I don't know, you may not have the information, but the length of their lives of doing this had to be short compared to...
Not so much the madams. Oh, right, sorry. So the length of life, so, you know.
If you were, obviously, if you were in a madam's house, you had
Right.
better
Sure.
care,
Yeah.
et cetera, and would possibly a longer life.
Okay.
There's really kind of two questions in this. Did any of those women that you could find marry any of the men that frequented there and always asked for her? Did that happen?
Okay, so yes, so length of life. So kind of the question is, you know, how long, what is our lifespan for women in the red light district? And again, it really depends on what we're looking at. So prostitutes had typically a shorter lifespan that we can see, right? They could leave and they did. And once they're out of my records, I can't find them. But we see a pretty high suicide rate, a high rate of drug use, and then obviously just sickness, right? She died from dropsy. But yes, if you worked in a brothel, madams would bring doctors in regularly, obviously to check for sexually transmitted diseases, but just to make sure you were healthy. And then in terms of the male customers and if they ever married them, you do see that in some places, kind of, I actually found it a lot more in Fort Worth than in San Antonio. So you would see a lot more women with men who patronized the red light district, which could turn into quite a combustible situation. There was lots of violence, lots of abuse, especially amongst male customers and women working in the houses, which again was another added benefit by being in a higher class brothel. You tend to have that less. But there are a few instances, especially in Fort Worth, of these women marrying men. And generally they're men, they might be like, they could own a saloon, or they might have been more of like a gambler or an outlaw, but you do see it a little bit in Fort Worth. I'm gonna bring that one. Okay. So in San Antonio, a conversation is emerging about preserving these old buildings. At the same time, downtown San Antonio has struggled economically. Is there a balance between historic designation and moving a city forward? What does that balance look like? That's a great question. I live in Fort Worth. I studied Hell's Half Acre first, and Hell's Half Acre's gone. They wanted to build the convention center, and they destroyed it, right? Anything that was left. So I don't think that's the way to do it. I definitely think there does need to be a balance, especially because these are stories that interest people, right? They're a little bit salacious, but still, they are interesting stories. And so I would definitely argue that there should be a balance. What that balance looks like, I'm not sure. If there was a public historian in the room, I would probably ask them what their thoughts were. But definitely, thinking about preserving some of them, just because red light districts very rarely get preserved, because for a lot of, especially west of the Mississippi, a lot of red light districts exist in downtown, and you get to a point when they've all been closed down in like the 40s and 50s, and cities just destroy them. So San Antonio, their red light district was outside of that city center, was adjacent to it, so it's a little bit different, but I vote for at least preservation of some of it, but I'm not as well versed in historic designation to give a good argument on that. I hope that answered your question. Might also be interested in Galveston. Author who published a book 2 years ago, she was also doing tours of the red light district. My dissertation was originally 3 cities. It was originally Fort Worth, San Antonio, Galveston, but I decided finishing my dissertation was more important than doing 3 cities, and so Galveston got the axe, unfortunately. Other questions in the room? Okay.
Any other questions? So I do actually have a question.
Yeah.
So when you were showing the architectural drawings of the parlor houses,
Yeah.
I got to wondering about the possibility of an architect that specialized in that.
Yeah, absolutely, there could have been. This is what's hard, is when you don't have personal records, you don't know who's doing all this. If they post it in the newspaper, I know. So for example, I know who built Sally Brewer's house because it lists in the building permit, so-and-so building for Sally Brewer. But Because I don't have their records, I don't have anything like ledger books, it's hard to say, but yeah, I mean, especially in larger red light districts where they might be doing more building, there could definitely be someone doing that, but for San Antonio, a lot of these houses just kind of pass hands, and so there might be some additions, but a few are built from the ground up, so definitely there could be. That's not something I have records about, unfortunately. Want me to do this or that?
Go ahead and take the ones in here
Okay.
first.
There's a question up on that I see, and that's very interesting. I'm curious if you have an answer for that.
Yeah. So the question is, imagine children were born in these brothels. Was there a way mothers could keep their children and still work, like daycare, which is funny. Obviously, children are a side effect of what these women are doing. Prophylactics do exist, but they are not as widely used, and obviously they're not very successful. So yes, women do have children. Again, I have more records of this in Fort Worth and in San Antonio. I had 2 different madams who actually raised their child in the house with them, and then they became a prostitute, which is an entirely different conversation. But one thing that you'll see a lot is reform groups who go into red light districts with the specific goal of taking children. So again, because I don't have those records of the houses, we can guess that yes, children are living in this red light district, especially since there are whole reform movements on getting them out, and especially since this is a nightly activity. So presumably, yeah, the children are around during the day, and then they go to bed, and then things happen. They do their work, but yeah, there's just not a lot of records about the children. And then there's a question.
Okay, we had a question in the back.
You touched on some of the houses in San Antonio are still there. Roughly how many are they in bad shape? Are they falling down, or are they in use now, or what?
I actually, of the west of the San Pedro Creek, I don't believe any of those dwellings are in existence. I know Fannie Porter's house had been for a while, but it went the way. The problem is that, gosh, and now I'm not gonna remember the highway. It's either 35 or the 410 exit ramp. Something like that was built on top of it. So a lot of those are gone. If you've ever been to the San Antonio Municipal Archives, for some reason, that actually exists in the old red light district. So there's not, as far as I know, I don't believe there are still any buildings in existence. If somebody on the chat knows more than me, I'm happy to take that answer, but I don't believe so.
So there's not a great deal left to.
No. And it may be that in downtown San Antonio, there are historic buildings that could at one time have been a house of prostitution since, like I said, those main and military plazas. But in what became the red light district, I don't believe there are. But again, I could be wrong. Are the Blue Book for visitors available to view in any libraries? You can Google them. They are in a lot of digital archives. I believe you can Google them. If not, I know that I believe the San Antonio Public Library has one. Maybe oh gosh, I'm gonna get the name. It's either UTSA's Special Collections or Texas A&M San Antonio's Special Collections. One of them has it as well. But yeah, I think I've pulled mine many times just off the internet because a lot of libraries will have that digitized. The Fort Worth Rescue Home in the 1890s were in part for pregnant prostitutes, and initially they took the babies away from the mothers and placed them for adoption. This changed to the option to keep their child. The Arlington Rescue Home mainly encouraged the mother to keep their child and place them back with their family or in employment, such as a servant, so that they could keep their child. This added population to the Nazarene Church. Yes, so in Fort Worth, and this is Ruth. Ruth is another local historian who's wonderful. Fort Worth, yes, had rescue homes who did do that, where they were active in, so started with taking the child, but then realizing that it's actually better for both mother and child for the child to stay with the mother. In San Antonio, there were also rescue homes who, again, saw that that was something that they needed to be doing as well. So, because at the end of the day, they just want to save these women, right? Yes?
You had commented here how the red light district of San Antonio had basically been active up until the Second World War. They tried to shut it down in the first, and I'm under the impression that here in Fort Worth that basically the military succeeded in getting it shut down here during the First World War. Why suppose, it seems like Fort Worth, the city fathers, we will relate some of those stories, you know, not in a wink, keep on going, kind of a deal. How it was that they succeeded in doing it here in Fort Worth where they didn't in San Antonio.
That is a great question. This is my last chapter of my dissertation. So these are what I believe are the reasons why. So the first thing is that the location of the red light district. Fort Worth's red light district, like I said, if you know where the convention center is, that is where it was. It was smack dab in the middle of the commercial district for Fort Worth. If you got off the train to get to the courthouse, you had to walk through the Fort Worth red light district to get there. And that was a big problem for businessmen, especially, or business leaders, especially in the 20th century. It was less in the 19th century because they had the cattle and the railroads, and so they saw it as actually bringing in more money. But as we shift into the 20th century, business owners start to say, this isn't good for Fort Worth, it's bad for our reputation, we need to get rid of it. So that's one reason. Fort Worth had a very, very strong reform presence. There was a man called J.T. Upchurch. He was really big on reform, and so they were very much like, we've got to shut this red light district down, get it out of here. And then the biggest reason, my argument, is that San Antonio is a military town. San Antonio has had a military presence basically since, like I said, as long as San Antonio's been there. Fort Worth actively courted to get Camp Bowie. They knew that the military was looking for camp locations, and Fort Worth said, okay, we want Camp Bowie. There are newspaper articles where they're basically saying, it might get rid of the red light district, but I think Camp Bowie's gonna bring more jobs. Camp Bowie's gonna bring us more. And so because of the secret, it's not the Secret Service Act, it's something like that, that was passed that started the draft. Selective Service, I knew it was two S's, thank you. The Selective Service Act actually included two amendments that said you could not have a red light district within 5 miles of an operating military base, fort, camp. And so when they chose Camp Bowie and when they put Camp Bowie there, they knew what was gonna happen is it was gonna kill the red light district, and it did. And so what happened is it shutters the red light district and it scatters all of those women. And so some move up to Jacksboro Highway, some move elsewhere, right? But it doesn't in any way get rid of prostitution, it just scatters it. But San Antonio, they've always had soldiers pretty much since the start of the red light district. And so it was much, much harder for them to go, okay, well, it's for the safety of the soldiers, when they're like, no, we've been here the whole time. Madams had relationships with Army men. Madams had relationships with leaders. And so you really do have, I think, all of those pieces. Location, reform movements, which were really big in Fort Worth. They were there in San Antonio, but not as big. And then just the military presence. Okay. Did the women voluntarily give their children to the reform groups? Sometimes. Sometimes they just took them. There was a reform group in Fort Worth where they would basically go in and kind of guilt them. Be like, how can you raise your daughter? How can you raise your son this way? Da, 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 da. We're gonna give them a better life. But it just varied on the women. Again, this is all from newspaper reports and from secondary reporting, so I can't actually tell you if they were doing it voluntarily or not. I can tell you what we think they were doing, but I don't have any of their records, so it's hard to say. Oh, 3510 by the downtown UTSA campus. Thank you. I was right, 35. Okay. Where did you first learn about the red light districts in Texas? My son took an elective San Antonio City course in high school and learned about it there. My undergraduate thesis I wrote with Light Cummins at Austin College. It was about Lonesome Dove. And basically my undergraduate thesis looked at how accurate Larry McMurtry was, which was that he is pretty accurate when it comes to cowboys and not at all accurate when it comes to women. It's all right, Larry. If you've read Lonesome Dove, you know that 2 of the 3 main characters are prostitutes. And so I had to then go in and try and find historical accounts and studies written on prostitution in Texas, but also in the West, and there were very few. And so that really led me down towards thinking about that as a subject. And then when I got to TCU, I worked with Dr. Rebecca Sharpless, and she was like, you know, Fort Worth had a red light district. It was a big one. And I was like, I kind of knew that. And so we really started looking at that. And then when it came time to do my dissertation, it was an easy easy thing to go, I want to talk about San Antonio too, because they just had such a long and such a large red light district. So that's the short, long answer. Yes, sir?
The basis for the shutdown of prostitution in military bases actually was a result of a federal lawsuit that was filed during World War II in New Orleans to shut down Storyville. And there was a federal law that was passed that had, I don't remember all the details, that had to do with prostitution being operational in any city where there was a military base. So there was a federal law on the books. And the problem that we're having in New Orleans was the fact there was no zoning. So if you had a residential home, somebody could buy a house next door and open up a house of prostitution. So,
Same in Houston, by the way. All right, thank you. That's helpful.
One more question here on the talking about the cribs. And you're talking about it being one room.
Yep.
I know I've looked at some of the Sanborn farmhouses myself, and here in Fort Worth, that the structures that they identify are rectangular in shape. They look like they might meet the definition of a shotgun house, as opposed to a one room. Of course, I guess what you could describe as shotgun could conceivably be one room, but typically you think of it as three rooms.
Right.
Any comment on that as to whether they were, or some of the structures that you know?
So roughly, and if you watch the Fort Worth one, you'll see I have a picture of the cribs. So it could have been shotgun and structure, but generally, it would have been one room. So there potentially could have been cribs that were shotguns as well. But for the most part, and like I said, there are pictures from Hell's Half Acre that have them, and the pictures that I showed you from San Antonio. They were generally like one long building, but divided into rooms, and then you would go up, and you'd open the door, and she would be there, and there would be a bed, and like I said, generally a stand with a bureau with a pitcher of water, which was standard prophylactic practice, I guess, washing yourself. Not great, but they did what they could do. But that's generally how it worked. That was the standard for cribs. Sometimes they were freestanding, but a lot of times it was one long building divided. Yeah. The rectangular, yes, sir, yeah. What was the comment about Sam Houston? And there was a Fort Sam Houston, which was a big deal. And
I think it wasn't about Sam Houston. You were saying something that was in.
Sorry, zoning, the same as in Houston, the zoning. He said that there was a comment made about zoning laws in New Orleans. There was no zoning, so you could have like a residential house next to a house of prostitution. The same was in Houston. There were no zoning laws, which caused some pretty significant problems. Houston also had a very large red light district. Another example of madams using a lawsuit, Thelma Denton, who was a very infamous Houston madam, sued the city of Houston for one of their laws. So it happens all over. Other questions?
All right.
Any comment any comment on the story about we've all seen Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and the picture of them riding around on the bicycle? Okay, and surely somebody else has heard this story too. Here that I had read at one time that supposedly that took place in Fort Worth, but then I'd read another story where, because there was a Fannie Porter.
There's a Mary Porter in Fort Worth, and so a lot of times people would transpose, the question's about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, a lot of times people saw that there was a Mary Porter in Fort Worth and assumed that was Fannie Porter, but Fannie Porter was San Antonio.
That supposedly, if this did in fact happen, that it took place in San Antonio. Have you ever heard or anything about it?
So they asked me about the bicycle scene from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, asking if I know. I haven't seen that in anything that I've studied. That it could have, but yeah, I have not seen that. So unfortunately, sorry, not a good answer.
That's probably more myth than anything.
Mostly, a lot of times. I mean, with Etta Place, the idea that she worked in Fannie Porter's, that's just kind of existed in tale. I don't have any proof that Etta Place lived in or worked in Fannie Porter's brothel, but it continues to exist. But yeah, any other questions?
All right, thank you so much. We appreciate your
Thank
attendance
y'all.
today.